The airport was full of noise, movement, and the usual hurry of travelers trying to reach their destinations. People pulled their suitcases quickly across the shiny floors, some talking loudly on phones, others running to catch boarding gates before they closed. Families huddled together, worried about losing each other in the crowd. The air was filled with the sound of rolling luggage, announcements echoing from the speakers, and the smell of coffee drifting from a cafe nearby. In this busy scene walked a man who didn't draw much attention at first. He was tall, dressed simply in a neat black suit, and carried a small leather bag in his hand. His face was calm, his eyes steady, and his steps slow but confident. To anyone watching, he looked like a businessman traveling alone, perhaps someone heading to a meeting in another city. There was nothing flashy about him, no security guards walking beside him, no staff helping him with bags. He seemed like an ordinary traveler among hundreds of others, but he was not ordinary. Hidden inside his jacket was an identification card that carried one of the most powerful titles in the country, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was used to living quietly, away from unnecessary attention, even though his work carried great responsibility. On that day, he had chosen to travel without fanfare, without his usual security team, because he believed in moving with simplicity and humility. As he walked calmly toward the security check area, 2 police officers stood nearby observing passengers. Their duty was to keep an eye out for unusual behavior, but instead of being fair and respectful, they often judged people by appearance. One of them noticed the man. "Look at him," the officer muttered to his partner. "He looks suspicious. Why is he alone? No one with him?" The other nodded. Without taking time to speak politely or ask questions properly, they stepped forward and blocked his path. "Hey, you there," one officer barked in a loud voice, making heads turn. The man stopped, slightly surprised at the tone. He turned toward them, his calm eyes meeting theirs. "Yes?" he replied softly. "What are you doing here?" "Show me your documents," the officer demanded harshly. The man didn't react with anger. He quietly reached into his pocket and handed over his boarding pass and ID. The officer barely looked at them before tossing a suspicious glance back at him. "Something doesn't feel right," the officer said. The passengers nearby slowed down, watching the sudden confrontation. Some whispered among themselves. The man, however, stayed quiet. He could have easily pulled out his FBI identification right then, but he didn't. He wanted to see how far this would go, how the officers would act when faced with a chance to show fairness. The second officer stepped closer. "Open your bag," he ordered. The man placed the bag on a nearby table and calmly unzipped it. Inside were only personal items, clothes neatly folded, a file of papers, and a book. The officers searched quickly, but instead of apologizing, they grew louder. "This doesn't look right," one said. "We'll have to take you in for questioning." The man looked at them, still calm, and asked in a steady voice, "Is this really necessary? I've done nothing wrong." His tone wasn't defensive, only patient. But the officers ignored his words. One grabbed his arm roughly while the other began taking out handcuffs. The crowd gasped. Several passengers had now stopped completely, forming a small circle at a distance. A mother whispered to her son, "That man didn't do anything." A young student pulled out his phone and began recording, sensing that this was not a normal situation. The officers didn't care about the growing audience. They believed they were doing their job, but their actions were colored by bias and arrogance. With a sense of authority, they snapped the handcuffs around the man's wrists. His leather bag was pushed aside carelessly. "You're coming with us," one officer said loudly, as if proud of the arrest. The man didn't resist. He didn't raise his voice or struggle. Instead, he let them guide him toward the small police station inside the airport. The way he walked with dignity and silence confused some onlookers. "Who is he?" someone whispered. "Why does he look so calm?" another asked. A woman in the crowd, bold enough to speak, called out, "Officers! You're making a mistake. He didn't do anything wrong." But one officer waved her away sharply. "Mind your own business, lady." The woman shook her head in disbelief, whispering to those near her, "This isn't right. They're judging him for no reason." As the officers dragged the man forward, the phones kept recording. The videos captured every second. The harsh tone of the officers, the quiet strength of the man, and the shocked faces of travelers around them. Some people felt uneasy, others angry, but no one dared to intervene further. Through all of this, the man's mind stayed clear. He had faced far more dangerous situations in his life, cases involving crime, intelligence, and threats to national security. Compared to those, this was nothing but a test of patience. He knew that the truth would reveal itself soon, and when it did, the officers would regret every word and every action. But he chose silence. He believed in letting people's true behavior show before stepping in with the truth. The short walk to the police office inside the airport felt longer because of the stares and whispers that followed. Some travelers shook their heads. Others raised their phones higher to capture better footage. The officers continued to act as if they had caught a dangerous criminal, though the man they held walked with such calm that it made their behavior look foolish to many. When they reached the small office, the officers pushed him into a chair. "Sit down," one barked. The man sat, his hands cuffed in front of him, his face still calm, his lips pressed together in patience. The officers stood proudly, believing they had done their job well. They didn't realize that within minutes the world around them would change completely. The passengers outside the glass window continued watching. More phones were out now, more eyes fixed on the strange and unfair scene. People could feel that something was wrong, but none of them yet knew the truth, that the man they had just seen handcuffed at the airport was not an ordinary traveler. He was the director of the FBI, a man of enormous power and responsibility, treated like a suspect because of careless judgment and prejudice, and so, the first part of this story ended not with anger or resistance but with silence and calm strength. The man waited patiently, knowing that the next moments would reveal everything and that justice always arrives, even if it comes later than it should. The airport police office was small, with white walls, a few chairs, and a desk piled with papers. A single fan moved slowly overhead, spreading the tense silence in the room. The two officers felt proud of themselves as if they had caught someone important. They didn't realize that their pride was built on a mistake that would soon embarrass them in front of the entire world. The director sat quietly on the chair. His hands were cuffed, but his posture was straight and his face was calm. He did not look angry, he did not shout, nor did he struggle. Instead, his eyes studied the room, the officers, and the situation carefully. His calm presence made the silence heavier. One of the officers broke that silence. "All right, mister," he said harshly, leaning over the desk. "Tell us the truth. Who are you really? Why are you walking around like that, pretending to be someone important?" His words carried suspicion, but also arrogance. The man answered in a soft voice, "I already gave you my ID and boarding pass. I am a passenger traveling today." His words were simple, polite, and calm, but the officers were not satisfied. They exchanged glances, shaking their heads. "You don't look like an ordinary passenger," the second officer added. "You're hiding something. Where were you before coming here?" He spoke quickly, not even giving the man a chance to answer fully. The director remained composed. "I told you. I came here to board a flight. That is all." But the officers were not listening. Their voices grew louder, their questions more aggressive. They seemed less interested in finding the truth and more interested in showing authority. Their tone suggested that they had already judged him guilty of something, though they had no evidence at all. Meanwhile, outside the small office, the airport atmosphere was changing. Passengers had gathered near the glass windows trying to see what was happening inside. Some whispered in shock. Others held their phones up high to record the scene. A few of them discussed quietly, saying things like, "This doesn't feel right, and why are they treating him this way?" The videos being recorded were already spreading across social media as people shared what they had just witnessed. Inside the office, one officer walked around the man's chair. "Why are you so calm?" "Normal people get scared when police stop them," he said, almost mocking him. The man looked up at him with steady eyes. "Because I have nothing to hide." The officer laughed lightly as if mocking the answer. "Everyone says that." Then, in a sudden act of disrespect, the officer pushed the man's bag roughly across the table, spilling some papers on the floor. "What's in here?" "More secrets," he said. His partner bent down to check, flipping through the papers without care. The director watched silently, his patience unbroken. Inside, he knew exactly what those papers were. Documents for meetings and work. Things that would clearly prove his importance if only they looked carefully. He also knew that his official badge and FBI identification were in the bag. He waited, knowing the moment was approaching when the truth would finally be seen. At the same time, the passengers outside grew restless. One woman in particular, the same who had tried to defend him earlier, pressed her face against the glass and called out, "He's innocent." You can see it in his eyes. Others nodded in agreement, though none could enter the room. The officers, however, ignored everything outside. They believed they were in control. "Listen here," one said, leaning closer to the man. "We can make this very difficult for you. If you don't speak the truth now, you'll spend the night behind bars." The director tilted his head slightly, his calm voice cutting through the heated air. "And what truth do you expect to hear? The one you already imagined, or the one that actually exists?" His words made the officers pause for just a second, but they quickly brushed it off. The interrogation dragged on. The officers asked the same questions again and again, each time sounding harsher. They tried to break his calm, but the man's silence and patience only made them more irritated. In their minds, they were certain that they were right. But the reality was that with every passing minute, they were digging a deeper hole for themselves. Meanwhile, the videos outside had spread beyond the airport. Within minutes, thousands of people online were watching clips of a calm man being treated unfairly by officers at an airport. Comments poured in from people saying, "Why are they treating him like this? And this doesn't look right." No one yet knew the man's true identity, but everyone could sense that something was wrong. Back inside the office, the tension grew thicker. The first officer stood up straight, sighing with irritation. "Enough of this game," he declared. "We're charging you for suspicious behavior. You're coming with us to the main station." The director didn't move. He simply looked at them with quiet strength, then lowered his eyes as if giving them another chance to stop before making their mistake even bigger. But the officers didn't notice the silent warning. They placed more pressure on him, even making rude remarks. Their voices echoed in the small room, reaching even the people outside who could faintly hear the raised tones. Some passengers gasped when they saw the officers pointing fingers and acting disrespectfully toward the man in the suit. The woman outside shook her head, whispering, "They don't know who they're talking to." She didn't know his identity either, but something in his calmness told her he was not ordinary. Inside, the man took a deep breath. His silence had lasted long enough. He had given them every chance to correct themselves, every chance to act with fairness. Now the moment was coming when he would finally show them who he really was. But he waited just a little longer. He wanted them to fully reveal their attitude before pulling back the curtain of truth. The officers, still blinded by their arrogance, were certain they were in control. They didn't know that within moments the very man they mocked and disrespected would show them something that would change their lives forever. The crowd outside leaned closer, sensing that something was about to happen. The phones kept recording, the tension kept building, and the quiet strength of the man only grew heavier in the air. Part 2 ended with the officers believing they had the upper hand, while the director's patience set the stage for the shocking revelation that was only moments away. The small police office at the airport felt tense. The officers stood with folded arms, staring at the man in the chair as if they had already proven his guilt. The man's wrists were still cuffed, but his posture was steady, his eyes calm. It was almost as if he was the one in control, not them. His silence unsettled the officers, though they would never admit it. One officer, growing restless, bent down to the leather bag they had tossed aside earlier. He unzipped it again and began pulling items out one by one. There were neatly folded clothes, a file of documents, and a book. The officer pushed them around carelessly, searching for something, anything that could justify what they had done. Then his hand touched a small black wallet tucked in the side pocket. Curious, he pulled it out and opened it quickly. Inside was a badge. The moment his eyes landed on it, his expression changed. His proud, almost arrogant face froze in shock. The badge glimmered under the bright light of the room, and next to it was an identification card with bold letters printed across the top. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Director. His throat went dry. He blinked several times as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "No, this can't be," he whispered under his breath. His partner, noticing his strange reaction, walked over and leaned in. When he saw the badge for himself, the color drained from his face. Both officers stood frozen. Their hearts began to pound. They quickly glanced at the man sitting calmly in front of them. For the first time, they noticed the weight of his quiet eyes, the authority hidden behind his silence. The man spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Now you understand." The sound of his words was like thunder in their ears. He had not shouted, But the weight of his calm tone was more powerful than any loud anger could be. The officers felt small, almost powerless, as the truth hit them. They had handcuffed and insulted not just any traveler, but the director of the FBI, the man who oversaw one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the nation. The officer holding the badge trembled. His hand shook so much he nearly dropped it. He quickly placed it back on the desk as if it was too heavy to carry. "Sir, we didn't know," he stammered. His voice cracked, his arrogance gone. The director leaned forward slightly, his calm gaze never breaking. "You had many chances to treat me fairly, but you chose not to." His words pierced the silence, making both officers lower their eyes in shame. Outside the office, the crowd of passengers pressed closer to the glass, sensing that something was happening inside. They couldn't hear every word, but they saw the sudden change in the officers' faces. The proud posture of the police had vanished, replaced by panic and fear. Phones recorded every second, ready to share the unfolding drama with the world. One of the senior airport security supervisors rushed into the room after hearing the commotion. When his eyes fell on the badge lying on the desk, he froze as well. His voice dropped as he whispered, "Director?" He looked at the man in the chair, then quickly turned toward the officers, his face turning pale. "What have you done?" The supervisor hissed at them. His voice carried both fear and anger. "Do you realize who this man is?" The officers could barely answer. They stumbled over their words, trying to explain, but their voices shook. Their arrogance had vanished completely, replaced with panic. The director remained calm. He did not gloat, he did not shout. Instead, he simply said, "Respect and fairness are not difficult to show, yet you refused." The supervisor hurried to unlock the handcuffs, his hands trembling as he worked the key. The moment the metal cuffs clicked open, the director rubbed his wrists gently but kept his posture composed. He looked at the officers, who now stood frozen in fear, their heads lowered. The supervisor bowed slightly, apologizing again and again. "Sir, please forgive this mistake." "They didn't know, please." His voice trailed off, unsure of how to repair the damage. The officers, realizing the gravity of what they had done, dropped to their knees in front of the director. Their proud faces were gone, replaced by desperation. "Sir, we beg you," one said, his voice breaking. "Please forgive us. We didn't mean—" But even as he spoke, he knew the videos recorded outside told the truth. There was no hiding what had happened. The director stood slowly, his presence towering over them even without raising his voice. "Do you beg because you are sorry?" he asked. "Or because you are afraid of the consequences?" His question cut straight through them. They could not answer. They only kept their heads low, ashamed. The passengers outside gasped as they saw the officers kneeling before the man they had once mocked. The scene was unbelievable. Just minutes ago, they had treated him like a criminal. Now they begged at his feet, their arrogance shattered. The director picked up his badge from the desk and placed it back inside his jacket. He looked at the supervisor and said quietly, "This should never have happened." His words carried the weight of truth, echoing in the room like a lesson carved into stone. The supervisor nodded quickly, sweat glistening on his forehead. "Yes, sir. It will never happen again." The director's calm eyes returned to the kneeling officers. "I do not need you to kneel," he said softly. "I need you to learn. Justice means fairness, no matter who stands before you." His words left everyone in the room silent. The officers felt tears prick at their eyes, realizing the depth of their mistake. The passengers outside, though they couldn't hear his exact words, could sense the power of the moment. They watched with respect, whispering among themselves about the calm strength of the man who had endured humiliation without anger. The truth was now revealed. The director's identity could no longer be hidden. Within minutes, the videos of the badge, the kneeling officers, and the shocked supervisor would spread across every screen in the country. The entire world would know how two arrogant officers tried to humiliate the FBI director, only to end up kneeling before him. But inside the small airport office, the man himself remained steady. His goal was not revenge, nor was it to destroy the careers of the officers. His purpose was far greater, to remind everyone present that respect, fairness, and humility were the true signs of strength. The air in the room shifted. No one spoke. The officers stayed on their knees, the supervisor stood pale with shame, and the director, calm and powerful, stood tall, preparing to walk out. The moment had transformed from an arrest to a lesson, one that none of them would ever forget. And outside, the passengers whispered one word again and again, the word that carried both shock and respect. Director. The airport office had turned into a place of silence and fear. The two officers were still on their knees, their proud faces gone, replaced with shame and desperation. The supervisor stood stiff, his hands wringing nervously, sweat forming at his temples. The passengers outside the glass windows pressed closer, their phones raised, recording every moment. What had started as a loud arrest had now turned into a scene of regret that the world would soon see. The FBI director stood calmly, his black suit neat, his eyes steady. He had not once raised his voice, yet his presence carried more authority than any loud command could. The silence stretched as everyone waited for his next move. At last he spoke, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. When you wear a uniform, you carry a responsibility. That responsibility is not power to abuse. It is a duty to protect and to be fair. Yet today you chose arrogance instead of justice. The words hung in the air, striking the officers like blows. Their heads sank lower. They wanted to speak, to defend themselves, but they had no defense. Their own actions had been recorded by hundreds of witnesses. The truth was already too clear. The supervisor tried to step in, his voice shaking. Sir, please. They are young and they acted without thinking. They didn't realize who you were. The director raised his hand, stopping him. It should not matter who I am, he replied firmly. Every person who walks through this airport deserves respect. A traveler, a worker, a family, or a child. No one should be treated the way you treated me. The supervisor bowed his head, ashamed. The officers' hands trembled as they pressed against the floor, still kneeling. The weight of the truth crushed them. Outside the office, the passengers whispered excitedly. Though they could not hear every word, they saw the fear on the officers' faces and the calm dignity of the man standing before them. Some passengers shook their heads, others whispered to their children, "Remember this. Never judge people by appearance." The director slowly walked toward the glass window. For a moment he looked at the crowd outside. His eyes met the passengers who had witnessed everything. There was no anger in his gaze, only strength and calm. Many felt a chill as they realized this was no ordinary man. He then turned back to the officers. "You kneel now, not out of respect but out of fear," he said softly. "But real respect is not forced. It is earned through fairness, honesty, and humility." His voice was low, but each word struck with the weight of truth. The officers felt tears forming in their eyes. One of them finally spoke, his voice breaking. "Sir, we were wrong. Please give us one chance. We will never repeat this mistake." The director studied them carefully. He could see the panic in their faces. He could also see that their regret was real, but it was born from fear of punishment, not from understanding the depth of their error. Just then, more senior airport officials rushed in. Their uniforms were neat, their faces pale with worry. The chief of airport security stepped forward, his voice trembling with respect. "Director, we are deeply sorry. We will handle this immediately. Those responsible will face strict action." The director turned his gaze on the chief. "Strict action is not enough," he said. "Punishment alone does not change hearts. What is needed is learning. They must understand why what they did was wrong, not only fear what will happen to them." The chief nodded quickly, though sweat glistened on his forehead. "Yes, sir. We will ensure proper training and correction. This will never happen again." The passengers outside gasped as they realized who the man truly was. Whispers spread like wildfire. "He's the FBI director." Phones flashed as people shared the revelation online. The story was no longer just about an unfair arrest. It had become a powerful lesson unfolding before the eyes of the nation. The officers still knelt, their eyes filled with regret. The director looked down at them, his voice steady. "You believed power gave you the right to humiliate. But power without respect is weakness. True strength is found in justice." His words seemed to echo in the small room, and even the senior officials lowered their eyes. The passengers outside leaned closer, many of them deeply moved by his calm wisdom. Finally, the director gave a small nod to the supervisor. "Remove them from duty today. Let them think about their actions. Let them understand what it means to truly serve." The supervisor quickly ordered 2 other officers to escort the kneeling men away. Their faces were pale, their bodies shaking as they stood and stumbled out of the office. The passengers outside watched, murmuring in shock at how quickly their pride had crumbled. Once they were gone, the director adjusted his jacket and picked up his small leather bag from the desk. He looked at the senior officials who still stood nervously in front of him. "Your airport is a place where people should feel safe. Never allow arrogance or prejudice to poison that safety." "Yes, sir," the chief replied immediately, his voice low with respect. The director walked slowly toward the door. As he stepped out of the office, the crowd outside parted silently. The passengers looked at him with awe, their phones still raised, their eyes wide. Some whispered blessings, others clapped softly, but most simply stared in silence, overwhelmed by the strength and calm of the man who had just turned humiliation into a powerful lesson. He walked with dignity through the crowd, his steps steady, his face calm. The passengers moved aside, some lowering their heads in respect. A few even wiped tears from their eyes, touched by what they had witnessed. The director did not seek applause or attention. He simply walked toward his gate, ready to board his flight, leaving behind a moment that no one at that airport would ever forget. Behind him, the senior officials scrambled to restore order, but the videos had already spread across the internet. Clips of the officers kneeling, the director's calm presence, and the shocked faces of passengers were already being watched by millions. The world was about to see the truth, but the man himself didn't think about fame or headlines. For him, the lesson had been given. The world would take from it what it needed, and the officers who had chosen arrogance over respect would never forget the day they were humbled by the very man they had mocked. The airport was buzzing with whispers long after he left the room. Families spoke about what they had learned. Travelers shook their heads in disbelief, and everyone knew they had just witnessed something rare, true strength, shown not through anger or force but through patience, calm, and the unshakable power of justice. The airport had returned to its usual rhythm, but the memory of what had happened inside the small office lingered in the minds of everyone present. Travelers walked by slowly, whispering to one another, showing each other the videos they had recorded. Phones were everywhere, screens glowing with images of the kneeling officers, the calm director, and the shocked expressions of passengers. The story was already spreading beyond the airport, reaching thousands within minutes. The FBI director walked steadily toward his boarding gate, his leather bag slung neatly over his shoulder. He did not hurry, nor did he rush past anyone. Passengers stepped aside, some bowing their heads slightly, showing respect without knowing exactly why. The director's calm confidence had left an impression that could not be shaken. Airport officials followed closely, ensuring the director's safety without being obtrusive. They still felt the weight of shame from the incident, understanding how close they had come to an irreversible mistake. The kneeling officers had been escorted to a private room, still shaken by the realization of their actions, knowing they would face serious consequences. The news spread quickly. Social media exploded with posts about the incident. Thousands of people watched as videos went viral, showing the officers kneeling in front of the director and begging for forgiveness. Comments ranged from shock to admiration, as viewers everywhere marveled at the calm and dignity displayed by a man who could have easily reacted with anger or intimidation, but chose patience and quiet authority instead. Back at the airport, the director paused for a moment near a window overlooking the tarmac. Planes took off and landed, carrying travelers to their destinations, unaware of the lessons learned inside the terminal. The director thought about the officers who had acted out of bias and fear. They had made a mistake, but he knew that punishment alone would not teach them the lesson fully. He believed in justice that corrected behavior, not revenge that destroyed it. The airport officials, still pale with worry, gathered around him. "Sir," the chief said, voice low and respectful, "we will implement immediate training programs. These officers will learn about fairness, respect, and responsibility. Nothing like this will ever happen again." The director nodded. "It is not enough for them to fear consequences. They must understand why their actions were wrong. They must learn humility, respect, and the true meaning of duty." Outside, passengers whispered among themselves, their faces reflecting awe. The quiet strength of the man had left a lasting impression. Some even approached officials to ask questions, wanting to ensure that such behavior would not be repeated. Others shared their recordings online, knowing that the story carried a lesson that the world needed to see. As the director approached the boarding gate, airport staff opened the path for him. The passengers moved aside, some smiling quietly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Children who had been watching the incident from the glass windows whispered to their parents, "Wow, he stayed so calm. That's amazing." Parents nodded, understanding that they had just witnessed an important lesson in patience, dignity, and justice. The two officers who had caused the incident were now in a separate room, sitting silently. They had been instructed to reflect on their actions. They looked at each other in disbelief, unable to speak. One finally whispered, "I can't believe it. We treated him like a criminal." His partner nodded, tears forming in his eyes. And he didn't yell, didn't fight back. He just stayed calm. And we were wrong. The director's words echoed in their minds. True strength is found in fairness and respect. Power without justice is weakness. They understood now that their mistake had not only embarrassed them, but also served as a lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, the passengers outside the office continued to watch and discuss. Many said they had never seen such composure in a real-life situation. Videos of the incident were shared worldwide, sparking conversations about the importance of fairness, respect, and humility in positions of authority. People across the country admired the director's ability to turn an unfair situation into a teaching moment. Back inside, the director boarded his flight quietly. Flight attendants and staff, now aware of his identity, treated him with respect, but he did not expect any special treatment. He chose to travel simply, as he always had, focusing not on recognition but on the principles he believed in. His calm demeanor and unwavering patience had left a lasting impression on everyone at the airport. The two officers were later suspended pending retraining and review. They did not complain or resist. They understood the gravity of their error and were willing to learn. The airport implemented new policies and training programs to ensure that no traveler would ever be treated with such bias again. The lesson was clear: respect, fairness, and humility were not optional. They were mandatory for those entrusted with authority. News outlets reported the incident as a story of patience, power, and justice. Headlines praised the director for his calm demeanor and wisdom, while the kneeling officer's actions served as a reminder that bias and arrogance could lead to serious consequences. Social media users shared their admiration and respect, saying things like, "He showed true strength by staying calm, and this is a lesson in dignity that everyone needs to learn." The director's quiet walk through the airport had become symbolic. People remembered not only the arrest but also how he had transformed the situation. By staying composed, he had turned fear and disrespect into a lesson that would resonate for years. Travelers, officials, and bystanders carried the memory of that day with them, understanding that true authority is shown through fairness, patience, and courage, not anger or intimidation. By the time his plane took off, the story had reached millions. The passengers, the staff, and the officers involved were left with a lesson they would never forget. The director had shown that even in the face of bias, unfair treatment, and arrogance, patience, calm, and the courage to act justly could transform the most humiliating moment into a powerful teaching experience. As the plane disappeared into the clouds, the airport slowly returned to normal. Travelers resumed their journeys, but whispers of the incident continued. The passengers who had witnessed it firsthand knew they had seen something extraordinary. The kneeling officers knew they had faced a truth they could never ignore, and the world had been reminded that real power is not in fear or force, but in fairness, respect, and quiet strength. The director, looking out of the plane window, thought about the lessons learned, not just for the officers, but for everyone involved. Justice, he knew, was not about humiliation or punishment. It was about teaching, about patience, and about showing strength through fairness. That day, at a crowded airport filled with people rushing to unknown destinations, he had turned a moment of prejudice into a lesson that would ripple far beyond the terminal walls. And so, the story ended, not with anger or revenge, but with understanding, humility, and the quiet power of a man who knew that true authority is measured not by force but by fairness.